Ka pai. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this webinar on the National Adaptation Plan Progress Assessment for 2026. Ko Miriana Johnson aho. I am a Senior Communications and Engagement Advisor with the Climate Change Commission, and I will be your host for this webinar. Without further ado, let's get underway hearing from our pukenga, from our experts. First up, I'd like to introduce our General Manager of Delivery, Robin Campbell, who's going to talk about the Commission's role in national adaptation planning. Over to you, Robin.
Kia ora, Mariana, and kia ora koutou. Thanks everybody for coming along today. I'm joined today by Sally Garden, who's the Project Director for this year's National Adaptation Plan Progress Assessment, and two of the Climate Change Commission's analysts for this project, Christie Marsh and Hugh Marshall-Tate. I'm going to quickly cover the Commission's statutory role regarding climate change adaptation and the key findings in the report that we've just released, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues for more detail and question and answer at the end. So climate change adaptation focuses on anticipating risk and reducing the exposure and vulnerability to hazards like floods or droughts ahead of time to build long-term resilience. This is so that fewer people, places, and systems are affected by those hazards in the first place. Investing in resilient infrastructure lowers the risks from climate change-fueled events and protects communities, whānau, and businesses from disruption and loss. At the Climate Change Commission, we have two functions supporting adaptation in Aotearoa New Zealand at a national level. Firstly, every 6 years, we deliver a national climate change risk assessment. The government then develops a national adaptation plan to respond to that risk assessment. And every 2 years, we monitor how effective the national adaptation plan is in responding to climate risk. That monitoring is what we're here to talk about today. This is the Climate Change Commission's second progress assessment of the current National Adaptation Plan. It looks at national policies and plans that have been announced, implemented, or discontinued from 2024 up until the 31st of May 2026. That includes work like the government's National Adaptation Framework, which was released last year. Climate action is not driven solely by central government, but from across local government, iwi and hapū, businesses, communities, and individuals. As part of our analysis, we gather insights through case studies and meetings and conversations with people on the ground. The barriers and gaps that communities have told us limit their ability to take action have informed the advice that we provide to central government. And I want to acknowledge everybody, including those who are watching today, who play a part in finding and putting adaptation solutions into place in your communities. So, our key findings. Firstly, at central government level, not enough is being done to adapt at the pace and scale that's needed to adequately prepare the country for climate impacts. 2 years on from our last assessment, the Commission has found that while there has been progress in some areas, many of the same gaps and barriers that we saw in 2024 remain, particularly around funding and financing, governance, and coordination. So this time our assessment report goes further. We've identified 6 areas for urgent action, and we've listed the ministers accountable for delivering on those areas. This acknowledges the substantive and coordinated effort that's required across government and across portfolios to drive adaptation action. An important message from our report is that better preparation reduces future harm and costs. Communities across the country are already experiencing more frequent, severe, and unpredictable climate impacts, including damage to homes and businesses, disruption to daily life, and rising costs, putting increasing pressure on communities, infrastructure, and local economies. We know that some climate impacts are unavoidable, but better preparation reduces the future harm and the costs of that. That's why the next 2 years are an opportunity to strengthen Aotearoa's adaptation system before the costs of delay grow any higher. I hand over now to Sally Garden, Project Director for this assessment.
Kia ora, thanks Robin, and thanks Mariana. Ko Sally Garden tōku ingoa. I was the Project Director for this second National Adaptation Plan Progress Assessment, as Robin mentioned. And I'm just going to take you over just a few slides talking about how we approach the assessment part of this task. As Robin mentioned, this is the Commission's second adaptation monitoring report, and our monitoring role and what we're required to do as part of this task is set out in legislation. We have to assess the implementation and effectiveness of the government's National Adaptation Plan, and to do that, there are a few things that we're required to do in law. We have to look at how well the plan responds to the most significant climate risks, and that's from the first National Climate Change Risk Assessment that was released in 2020. We have to assess progress implementing the actions in the National Adaptation Plan. We have to look at barriers to the effectiveness of the plan. And we have to look at the degree to which the objectives of the plan have been achieved. So based on that, all those things that we're required to do in law, our approach to this assessment, which you see on the slide there, focuses on three key things. The first one is looking at the quality of the plan itself. That's really about the adequacy of the plan and how likely it is to set Aotearoa up to achieve good adaptation outcomes. We're looking at things like whether there are any key policy gaps that will affect the effectiveness of the plan. And the work sitting under this part of our assessment includes things like looking at how well the plan addresses the most significant risks and identifying key barriers to its effectiveness. The second part of our assessment is focused on implementation and how well implementation is progressing. So that's really about looking at, is the government doing what it said it would do when it said it would do it? And that part of our assessment draws largely on agency reporting. And then the third part is about understanding how things are playing out in practice. Is the speed and direction of change we're seeing in line with needs and expectations? This is a really challenging part of the assessment and one we'll continue to iterate over time, but it's really looking at how things are playing out on the ground. And then we pull all of that analysis together to look at the overall effectiveness of the plan and progress towards the plan's objectives. So looking across all that analysis, our assessment has found some encouraging signs of progress, and we've really focused our assessment, as Robin mentioned, on the 2 years since our first progress assessment in 2024. We've really focused on that time period. There are some encouraging signs of progress, and these include, for example, the proposed requirements for local adaptation planning that have been proposed through amendments to the Climate Change Response Act, with links to proposed spatial plans. That's really positive because it will give councils a mandate for adaptation planning and clarify some roles and responsibilities. And that was a real gap that we pointed to with our first progress assessment. Recent resource management reforms and amendments have also helped clarify and strengthen council's ability to decline land use consents or impose relevant conditions where there is significant natural hazard risk for new developments. That's also really positive. And there's other work that we point to in our assessment as well that we see as a good step forward. For example, work to improve climate risk information, for example, through the New Zealand flood maps and updates to the natural hazard portal. And we also point to some really good planning that's happening, for example, through the DOC National Adaptation Plan and the Biodiversity Strategy and emergency management reforms as well. However, our assessment also finds limited progress in some important areas and some significant gaps. And some of the key issues that we identified 2 years ago remain unresolved. And the gap between what's in place and what's needed remains large and in some cases is widening. The significant gaps include, for example, there haven't been any decisions about how different adaptation processes and options will be paid for, and there are no new public and private investment pathways or mechanisms to support proactive adaptation. This holds back adaptation action in a whole range of areas. It's a significant gap. We also find that there are still some broader laws, institutions, and funding arrangements that are not aligned with climate resilience or that don't adequately account for climate change risk. And in some cases, that could undermine adaptation or increase the risk of maladaptation. We provide some examples of that in the report itself. There are also some persistent gaps in knowledge, information, capability, and coordination that we're seeing. We also noted a lack of tools and guidance in some key areas, for example, to effectively use climate risk information in decision-making and targeted at reducing that risk of maladaptation. There are some important reforms underway, as I just noted on the previous slide, but overall progress is fragile and stronger foundations are needed. I'm just going to move now to talking a little bit about our recommendations for handing over to my colleague Christie. In our report, we provide advice and recommendations to the government. That advice and recommendations draws on the findings that I've just mentioned from the assessment part of our analysis, but it also draws on the extensive analysis and engagement that was carried out, the Commission carried out for the second National Climate Change Risk Assessment, which was delivered earlier this year. The risk assessment sets out the priorities for decision makers, businesses, and communities to act on. And the next National Adaptation Plan, which is due in 2028, is required to respond to that risk assessment. That's why we've drawn on the analysis and engagement carried out for that, alongside what we've found through our assessment and monitoring to identify areas where more action is needed and to set out our advice and recommendations for action. So I'll hand to my colleague Christie Marsh now, who'll talk you through the recommendations.
Thanks, Sally. Tēnā koutou, ko Christie Marsh toku ingoa. I'm a senior analyst here at the Commission. So as Sally said, in our advice, we identified 6 key areas where urgent action is needed. These 6 areas are foundational elements and all are needed to enable effective adaptation action. So in our report, we make a high-level recommendation for each one of these areas, along with more detailed advice that identifies the initial steps central government should take. So now I'll just take you briefly through our advice in each of these areas. So our first recommendation is to be clear about how the costs of adaptation will be paid for. As it stands, there is not enough resource available to support proactive adaptation in New Zealand. There is also confusion about who should be paying for what and how these things should be funded. These are complicated questions with no easy answers, especially when we're considering adaptation options that involve relocating communities. There has been a lot of different reports and advice to government on these issues, but there has still been no concrete decisions. So our advice notes 2 key roles for central government. Firstly, to provide co-funding for adaptation action. Climate risks and impacts won't be evenly felt. A degree of national risk sharing is needed through some level of central government co-funding. Secondly, central government needs to work with local government and private sector organisations to develop and enable new kinds of funding and financing mechanisms. This includes, for example, co-funding mechanisms, new tools and mechanisms for local government to pay for adaptation, and targeted financial instruments to unlock private sector investment. Moving on to our second recommendation. Government needs to put in place legal requirements for local adaptation planning. These need to be supported by appropriate guidance, tools, and funding options. These legal requirements are important for ensuring local government have the mandate to prioritise and carry out effective local adaptation planning and implementation. The proposed legislation the government has introduced is a positive step forward, but the support from tools and guidance are also essential. It is these that ensure that there will be clear roles and responsibilities, consistent approaches to assessing climate risks, adaptation measures and their costs and benefits, and clear processes for things like planned relocations. This recommendation relates really closely to the first recommendation around funding and financing. Funding barriers are often hamstring local adaptation planning processes from moving from planning to implementation. So our advice is that legislative requirements need to be supported by appropriate funding and financing pathways. Local government and their communities need to know what these options are before they start planning, so financial considerations can be taken into account in the planning process. Moving on to our third recommendation. We're advising that climate adaptation is built into key legislation. Our analysis shows that climate change is absent or insufficiently considered in some of the legislation that governs how Aotearoa New Zealand develops and manages its natural and built environment. That means that as a country, we are still making decisions from where and how to build houses and infrastructure and what kinds of land use activities should happen where, without adequately considering the full range of impacts from climate change, now or in the future. In the report, we've provided some examples of key pieces of legislation that we think needs to be amended first, and where current reforms provide a good opportunity to do so. The ministers mentioned beside this recommendation are responsible for these pieces of legislation. On to the fourth recommendation. Access to high-quality data is important to support risk-informed decision-making for everyone. New Zealand already has a strong evidence base on current and future climate risks, which provides a solid foundation, but it can be improved. Our analysis finds that climate data and information is often fragmented, hard to access and use, and new research often project focused and not always focused on key gaps and needs in the system. We are advising that central government has a key role to play in coordinating climate risk research, data and information so it is accessible, usable, and focused on the country's highest priority challenges. This will require effective coordination and governance, sustained long-term investment, and the development of systems to support accessibility. We also advise that guidance and tools are needed to support the climate risk-related information to be used and communicated effectively, for example, in risk assessment processes or other types of decisions and processes. A next recommendation. There is significant adaptation work already underway in communities across Aotearoa New Zealand. Many hapū marae and Pakihi Māori are driving action that strengthens resilience, protects taonga, and supports communities during climate events. This work has benefits for the whole of New Zealand. But our analysis finds that these efforts are limited and constrained by a lack of resourcing. There is opportunity for central government to accelerate adaptation action by providing a sufficient and sustainable approach to funding the adaptation work iwi Māori undertake. We note that the Māori Climate Platform has been the main mechanism for meeting obligations to iwi Māori, but that all funds available through the platform have now been allocated, and no alternative arrangements or future funding options have been outlined, which creates uncertainty. Right now, iwi Māori-led adaptation work also tends to rely upon strong local partnerships and funding, which is subject to individual council funding priorities, which leads to variable outcomes. And our sixth and final recommendation. Our analysis shows that national adaptation planning doesn't currently provide the clear direction, priorities, and support needed to coordinate national and local adaptation action and drive change at the pace and scale required. And this is neither the National Adaptation Plan nor the National Adaptation Framework that was released last year. With the next plan due in 2028, the next 2 years are critical to make sure that the foundations set out and our other recommendations are in place so the plan can drive real change, but also to make sure the next plan sets out a clearer shared direction for Aotearoa New Zealand. We're advising that the next plan be developed in a way that more effectively sets us up as a country to respond to risks and adapt to a changing climate. Our advice sets out what that plan needs to include based on international best practice. I will now pass on to Hugh to talk to you about our National Insights report.
Thanks, Christie. So alongside our main report, we delivered a companion report, National Insights Relevant for Adaptation Planning, and which is available on our website now. This report contains data at a national level that relates to aspects of climate-related risk, exposure, vulnerability that are relevant for adaptation planning. It builds on the key national metrics work we did as part of our 2024 progress assessment. And we've updated these metrics from 2024 and added some new ones. These metrics are intended to support our progress assessment, and they touch on multiple areas relevant to our recent risk assessment from earlier this year. The metrics do not directly measure adaptation yet, but they do provide useful insights to support national level adaptation planning. While the report does provide district level insights for elements of climate risk, obviously more specific local data will be needed to inform community level adaptation planning. I'll just give you a quick run through of the metrics we included in the report, but I'm not going to talk them in detail here. So we've got 7 metrics across 4 categories, covering isolation, so covering exposure, isolation, social vulnerability, and availability of services. We've updated our exposure analysis to include inland flooding and rainfall-induced landslides, in addition to coastal flooding. Some districts already have significant numbers of people's buildings, infrastructure exposed to climate-related hazards, with some areas facing multiple hazards at exposure. On top of that, we've introduced a location-based measure of extreme heat, making it relevant to all areas of New Zealand. It shows that extreme heat is expected to become much more common across the country. And as we highlighted in our 2026 risk assessment earlier this year, the more frequent and extreme heat can have significant effects on the health and well-being of people, as well as ecosystems and economic activity. Turning to the next category, isolation, we've updated our estimates of population at risk of isolation and extended our analysis of isolation to look specifically at businesses. These metrics show that climate impacts can affect people even if they're not directly within a hazard zone, because flooding can cut off roads that provide essential access to essential services, isolating communities, businesses, households, and disrupting transport routes. Next, social vulnerability. This is an area we've made improvements by looking at the social vulnerability of those directly exposed or isolated by coastal flooding. The metric demonstrates that climate change will not affect everyone equally, with some communities facing both higher exposure to climate hazards and greater vulnerability to harm. Finally, we've also included a metric that provides information on the availability of household insurance at a national level. For those interested in learning more about this work, we're going to host a webinar next month on September 14th. I'll hand back to you, Robin.
Thank you, Hugh. Looking forward to that September 14th webinar too. So what happens next? Under the Climate Change Response Act, which sets out the Commission's functions, the government has 6 months to respond to this progress assessment and issue in a formal response that gets tabled in Parliament. But the recommendations we have made, along with the findings of our other adaptation work like the risk assessment, are designed to support the development of the government's next adaptation plan, which is due in 2028. So, in summary, the work planned and underway to help Aotearoa adapt to the changing climate at a nationwide level is not yet enough. Progress is patchy. Work isn't happening at the pace and scale needed, and too many of the same gaps remain since our last progress report. The nationwide foundations need to be fixed. Clear responsibilities, effective funding and financing pathways, better climate risk information, stronger planning, and more coordinated action are the foundations that can guide decisions and direct investment to where it's needed the most. The next 2 years before the next national adaptation plan is due are critical to closing these gaps before the costs of delay grow higher. The longer key gaps remain unresolved, the harder and more expensive it will be to protect communities, infrastructure, businesses, and the economy from growing climate risks. Our advice acknowledges the breadth of this work and how responsibility for it is shared across governmental portfolios to ensure it can be coordinated in a cohesive and effective manner, in a manner that will enable and reduce the barriers to action at a local and community level. Thanks. We now have time for Q&A. Mariana, back to you.
Hapai, tēnā koutou. Thank you so much to all of our team who've just presented then, Robin Campbell, General Manager of Delivery, Sally Garden, the Project Director for the National Adaptation Plan Progress Assessment, and 2 of our analysts, Christie Marsh and Hugh Marshall-Tate. I'm going to invite you all to join us in answering all of your questions. I can see them all rolling in now, which is fantastic. So we'll get underway. Just a quick reminder beforehand, though, if you see a question similar to one you'd like to ask or something that you think should be asked sooner rather than later, then you can always upvote. I want to start with a question here that we've got from Alex McMillan when I can pull my Q&A chat further over so I can see the full question around food security. While I'm working that technical issue out, I'll ask a quick question from Sally, one we've pre-prepared for Sally. What does the Commission want to see from the flood map? Sally, can you pick that up while I sort myself out? Kia ora.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mariana. Yeah, as I noted when I was talking through our assessment, we do see the flood map as a really positive step forward, as a sign of progress. It's really important towards creating a more consistent national picture of flood risk. And as many of you will be aware, flooding is one of New Zealand's most significant climate-related hazards. And historically, information about flooding has been sort of fragmented with different methods, assumptions, models, and level of detail used in different places and in different contexts around the country. So the flood map has got real potential to support adaptation planning, land use management, insurance, property decisions, and community preparedness. But the long-term value of the flood map does hinge on a few things. From our perspective, we see that it very much needs to be developed, maintained, and used as part of a wider national climate risk information system. So the map will be most useful if it has really clear governance, sustained investment, consistent data standards, and it will be important that it's expanded to include other hazards over time. Flooding is a really important one, but it's far from the only climate-related hazard where this nationally consistent information is needed. A few other things that are really important is accessibility. The map will only be useful if it is accessible to the people and the organisations who need to use it to support their decision making. That's been a real challenge in the past with climate risk data in New Zealand. And finally, information on its own doesn't reduce risk. So the government is going to need to also provide guidance and tools on how the data and the map should be interpreted and applied. So that includes things like guidance around its limitations, uncertainties, and appropriate use and scale of use. That's really important because without that, the information might be used in inconsistent ways to inform decision making and could be used in ways that aren't appropriate, but also that it may be that without that, the map could just sort of increase awareness, but not actually inform decision making. And that's what we really need, informed decision making to reduce exposure and vulnerability. So it's really important that while a positive step forward, it needs to be part of this coordinated, sustained national system.
Tēnā koe, Sally. Thank you very much for that. Hope that was helpful for you all. We will now go to Alex's question, who was first out the gate. So is future food security being seen as a specific national knowledge and governance gap? Pātai Pai, I wonder if to start us off, Sally, you could pick up that question.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, just struggling to find my unmute button. In terms of food security being a specific national knowledge or governance gap, we haven't looked at food security in detail in and of itself as a specific issue for this progress assessment, but sort of issues related to food security do come in through a couple of the different work streams in our assessment. For example, we have to look at how well the National Adaptation Plan addresses the risks from the first risk assessment. And so obviously issues around support for the agriculture sector and the food sector broadly comes into that. One of the things that we found in looking at how well the adaptation plan responds to those is that there are quite a few actions in the National Adaptation Plan that are intended to support the agriculture sector. There are some other sectors that there's less focus on in the National Adaptation Plan. But so we sort of talked about it in broad terms like that, but really in terms of drilling down to food security as an adaptation, as it's represented in adaptation action. We haven't looked at that in more detail, though the National Climate Change Risk Assessment have touched on that.
Thank you, Sally. I really hope that was helpful for you, Alex. I want to move to a question here that's had quite a few upvotes from Rob Bell around the question is, will the government or minister response occur before the election, or will it be shuffled to the next government? I want to hand that question over to you, Robin.
Thanks for the question. So the government has 6 months to issue a response to this report, which takes it through till after the election. The decisions on when that response will come are really decisions for the government and not for the Commission to be making. So the short answer is we don't totally know, but they have 6 months.
Easy, short and sweet. Now I want to go to a question from Donovan Burton around cascading risks originating overseas. So does the Commission assess cascading risks originating overseas, such as climate impacts that transmitted to New Zealand through supply chains, food and energy prices, trade, finance, insurance, migration, and geopolitical instability? If these questions were outside the scope of this review, does the Commission consider them important gaps for its future monitoring and advice to government? Really great question. Lots of interest in that partai as well. I want to, in the first instance, pass to you, Robin. Is this something that the Commission look at these climate impacts that originate overseas generally?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you. And I mean, we know that climate change is a global phenomenon and is affecting every country in related but slightly different ways, and that given the interconnected nature of the world, how hazards and risks are experienced in one country does flow through to other countries, particularly in a place like New Zealand, which is so isolated but interconnected economically and in terms of supply chains. The Commission's mandate in law is primarily to look at domestic policy settings within New Zealand. So we have not to date put a strong focus on risks that originate overseas and cascade through into New Zealand. We have started looking at things like supply chains, and also, you can also look at people movement and migration, but we're very early in terms of looking at that in detail in our work, because our primary focus is on the government's actions within New Zealand, but definitely an area which is worth looking at more, and yeah.
Yeah, kia ora, Robin. I just wondered actually, because this touches on our National Climate Change Risk Assessment. Sally, if you could speak a little bit to how these two pieces of work fit together.
Yeah, thanks, Mariana. Yeah, that's a really important point. As I mentioned, we released the second National Climate Change Risk Assessment earlier this year. That's something that happens every 6 years. Sorry, excuse me. And the government's next National Adaptation Plan has to respond to that risk assessment, to the highest priority risks identified through that. Our monitoring role, as Robin sort of set out when he introduced early on in our presentation, has an important role monitoring progress of the action that is happening, including through the National Adaptation Plan. So part of assessing how well the risks in that risk assessment are addressed. So for that reason, although our assessment of progress this time around is assessing a national adaptation plan that was built to respond to the previous risk assessment, and that's part of why we've decided that our progress assessment, when we talk about national adaptation planning more broadly than just the National Adaptation Plan as it was released in 2022, because as you'll all be aware, an awful lot has happened since then that's really material from an adaptation policy perspective. And for the same reason, was really important that we drew on the really considerable engagement, analysis and work that was carried out for the risk assessment to inform the advice that's contained in this plan. The government is already working on preparing the next National Adaptation Plan to respond to that risk assessment. So the advice that we include in this progress assessment, it's really important that it's a sort of joined up, coherent piece of work that draws on both of these things. They're very closely related.
Kia ora, Sally. I hope that additional context was helpful for you, Donovan, and those of you who upvoted that question. Feel free, if you have any follow-ups, to post those in the chat as well. Really important questions in understanding how what we consider in our adaptation monitoring work, as well as our risk assessment mahi. I want to pick up a question here from Suze Keith. The partai is around how we can reduce climate risk via the regional spatial planning process. I'm going to pass to our analyst, Christie Marsh, to answer this question.
Yeah, kia ora. So we looked at, I guess, the resource management reforms in general in terms of under our recommendation to embed climate change into key pieces of legislation. We saw that there was a real opportunity with the current resource management reforms to embed adaptation into our planning system, which is currently not in there. So that's kind of one way in which we looked at it. And then in the other way that we looked at it was via thinking about how the proposals for spatial plans to require local adaptation planning in priority areas. So we looked at how that would need to be supported by appropriate tools and guidance for clear and consistent risk assessments in order to make that happen. So being really clear, I think, in our advice around how the requirements for local adaptation planning through the CCRA and the regional spatial planning process will work together and how they will be kind of integrated and kind of work together in a pragmatic way.
Kia ora, Christie. I want to move now on adaptation planning. A question here from Troy. Given the government has made clear that adaptation planning will be a key component in the development of regional spatial plans, do you therefore see that adaptation will need to be funded by unitary or amalgamated authorities rather than supported by the government? A great question here. I would want, in the first instance, I want to pass to Sally to pick that up.
Sorry. Yeah, good question, Troy. And we see the developments around requiring local governments to undertake adaptation planning is really positive for some of the reasons that we've already talked about in the presentation. There was still until the amendments are passed, a real gap around a sort of strong mandate for local government to carry out this action, which really affects their ability to get funding to carry it out as well when it's not a sort of mandated requirement. So this is a really positive positive step forward. In terms of your question about whether in light of adaptation planning and a key component in the development of regional spatial plans, the question of that for funding, we really do make clear in our advice that we do see there is a role for central government funding as well. It's central government funding in some form, and we don't sort of set out specifics in what we think that should look like, because there are a range of different ways that could look. But there is a strong case for some central government funding because risks from climate change will fall very unevenly across the country and on different communities, and also the ability to prepare and respond and cope with those risks also varies hugely across the communities and the region. So that's a real reason for some level of societal risk sharing. But exactly what that looks like, we haven't given advice on that, but it is really important that there is some clarity provided around what that will look like as local governments start to develop their local adaptation planning. But I'll just say, Christie, do you have anything to add on that one?
Ka pai. While we wait for Christie to join us, I want to stay with you for a second, Sally, around flood mapping, which you talked to at the top of this Q&A session. A question here from Hilary Webb around the concept of a national flood map. Love the concept of a national flood map, but will it guide decision-making at a property and subdivision level? Any comments on scalability? Sally?
That's quite a hard question to answer without having seen. The flood map hasn't been developed yet. It's only just starting to be developed right now. So I really can't make comments about that, but I would just re-emphasize some of the things that I spoke about a moment ago, that it will be really important that the flood map, the tools for how that information should be used in different types of decisions and guidance around how to do that is really important alongside the flood map. Because depending on what that map looks like, the answer to that question might be different, but it's important that people understand appropriate use of it and what its limitations are so that it can be used appropriately.
Ka pai. Watch this space. Thank you for that question, Hilary. I want to move now to a question from Alex around the Waitangi Tribunal Climate Change Priority Inquiry, which is currently reaching its conclusion. He asked, how has the advice been How has this advice taken into account that inquiry? Robin, I want to hand to you to pick up this partai.
Kia ora, Alex. At the Commission, we know from our engagement around Aotearoa that many iwi and hapū face climate change in particular ways, which are often linked to particular historical and structural factors impacting on the use of Māori land, land alienation, particular exposure to particular industries and things like that. We also know that many iwi and hapū are at the forefront of climate change adaptation action in their local communities, doing some incredible work, and we hear from them about what would enable that work to scale up and be rolled out further for the benefit of everyone in those areas, actually. The Waitangi Tribunal is conducting an inquiry into climate change issues, which we have, we are definitely watching it with interest because it's very topical for our work. Because the inquiry hasn't yet concluded and hasn't yet made any findings, we don't formally incorporate that into our analysis at this point. But once the tribunal has finished its work, we will be able to pick that up and look at it as insofar as it applies to what the Commission is required to do under the law.
Kia ora, Robin, and kia ora, Alex, for that question. I want to move now to a question around national adaptation at a local government level from Ganja Dari. The partai is how far does the Commission consult councils, and how about the assessment of use of National Adaptation Plan and its recommendations at a local government level? Sally, I want to hand that question over to you.
Yeah, kia ora, thank you. As I know, everyone on this webinar will be very aware of, like, local government is really, really key in the adaptation space. Climate impacts play out locally, and a lot of the action that happens in the adaptation space is really driven at a local level. So the really key thing for us, given our national level monitoring role, is one of the key questions we ask is how well the National Adaptation Plan and national adaptation planning more broadly creates the kind of enabling environment that supports adaptation to happen the way it needs to at the local level. We do talk a lot to councils, obviously one of the key groups that we engage with on a whole range of our work, but in the adaptation space particularly, because the way it plays out locally is so key. We engage through a range of forum, including, for example, the Aotearoa Climate Action Network and now ASAP, the Society of Adaptation Professionals, and through other conversations that we have through Te Ura Kahika, etc. And when we're engaging in the regions, we're always engaging with councils as well. With our first National Adaptation Plan Progress Assessment in 2024, we did a huge amount of engagement with local government, and that really informed the work in identifying some of the really key barriers to adaptation action now, and we're assessing progress to those same barriers now. And also we drew on local government engagement that happened to support the climate change risk assessment as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sally. I hope that was helpful for you. Lots of questions here, understandably, around how this works at a localized level. So thank you all for those very insightful partai. I want to move now to a question from Nina. Are there any particular approaches that the Climate Change Commission is developing which might, for instance, give a range of possible options or scenarios for how climate adaptation could be financed in certain situations, help the government consider how much co-funding it might put towards a particular climate adaptation project? Robin, what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, and some of my colleagues might also have thoughts. This is an area which we go into in some detail in this report, because there are a lot of good ideas out there about how different types of adaptation could be funded. One of the examples we put forward in this report is the way transport projects are funded in New Zealand through the National Land Transport Fund, with a cost-sharing approach, and councils putting forward their projects in order of priority, being assessed against clear criteria, and then decisions made where that cost is shared. But which is, we think, something that is a useful contribution to this conversation. But we also note that there have been a number of really robust, credible reports, other suggestions from other organisations, other groups, parliamentary select committees, independent advisory groups, various academics and people from the private sector. The issue is not so much that there aren't good ideas, it's that no one has chosen which ideas are going to be used. So the issue is we don't know who's going to pay for what. From the Commission's perspective, it's time to make a decision about those things and then get on with it, I suppose. Because until we have decided as a country about who's going to pay for what, we're stuck in this react and respond approach, which means that we can never really get ahead of the risk by investing in resilience and adaptation. I don't know, Sally or Christie, did you want to add anything?
No, great answer. Thanks, Robin.
Fantastic. Thanks, team. I want to move now to a question from Gavin Ide around the recommendations from this report that have pointed to a range of multiple government ministers. What is the Commission's views or the findings on fragmentation of portfolios being a handbrake on coherent adaptation planning progress? In the first instance, I want to put this question to you, Robin. What is our view on the fragmentation of portfolios being a potential handbrake?
Yeah, Gavin, that's an interesting way to look at it. Thank you. I think probably I think from the Commission's perspective, it's not so much that fragmentation becomes a handbrake, but that effective adaptation is always going to require cooperation and working together across different areas because of the way climate change affects many, many different aspects of life in Aotearoa New Zealand. We are always going to need some good communication, coordination across the parts of government which look after those different parts of the way we run our communities. So, infrastructure is a very clear area, but there are other aspects of climate risk which move beyond infrastructure, and you wouldn't necessarily want to combine all the responsibilities together. Ultimately, the structures of how governments choose to structure themselves for the governments. What the Commission's role is to say is that given those structures and those choices, here's how you could use your structures and choices and frameworks to drive action.
Maybe I'll just add one thing. I agree with everything that Robin just said. I think it also relates to one of our recommendations, which Christie talked through around some pieces of legislation not aligning well with climate and adaptation outcomes. And that's perhaps not getting right to your question about fragmentation, Gavin, but it is really important when you have sort of different pieces of legislation that govern the built and natural environment that aren't embedding climate, that don't have climate change embedded into them, makes that fragmentation easier to happen.
Yeah, tēnā kōrua. Thank you for that really helpful question and answers there. I want to move now to a pātai from Kat, talking about local government again, being very popular on this webinar. What do you think needs to be put in place through a local government reform to get better outcomes? Do we have any recommendations or opportunities through this reform that you could summarise and enable us to speak to? Sally, your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, a couple of things I'd highlight there related to different aspects of the advice that we give in this report. As we talked about, the proposals for local adaptation planning are really positive, but in our advice we talk about some of the things that will be really important to have alongside that helps to address one particular challenge around having a legal mandate, but it's really important that there's sort of guidance and tools alongside that for how that should happen and what that should look like, how decisions are made through that adaptation planning process, including things like around risk assessment. But also I think it's really important to acknowledge that that's going to be a really challenging, time-consuming and lengthy process that's going to require a lot from local government for it to be done well. And that's part of what relates closely to our recommendation around the need new funding and financing mechanisms to support this local adaptation planning work. And there are other challenges as well that will need to be addressed there, like it's hugely intensive. A good local adaptation planning process requires a lot of really important skills and a lot of capacity and capability that's needed to have a process that can last a very long time to be done well. And I think it's really important that local government are able to have what they need to carry those out well. So that's just speaking to a couple of the aspects that we talk about in our advice around the local adaptation planning part of this.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sally. I hope that was helpful for you, Kat. Again, great questions around how this work at a national level can then be implemented and applied at a local level. So just letting people know, we've got 6 minutes left. We've had so many questions rolling in. We have a few more to go. So if we don't quite answer your question, don't worry. We will get back to you after the webinar. And all of the questions, of course, will be available via on video that will be posted on our website and a Q&A that we'll post up about it as well. So don't fear, we will get to your questions. Thank you. All right, I want to now go to a question from Alex again, who's been keeping us busy on this webinar. Tēnā koe, Alex, around land ownership and governance models. How are these being seen as a gap? I want to hear your thoughts, first of all, Sally, on that question.
Sorry, I should just keep myself unmuted. I keep having problems finding the unmute button. Sorry. We don't explicitly mention that. That's not something that we mention specifically in the report itself. But we do acknowledge, and particularly in chapter 4 of this report, that really focuses on where the sort of key barriers are from an iwi Māori perspective. We do note that there are some specific barriers for iwi Māori, and some of those relate to questions around land ownership and the ability to actually change land use and some of the challenges around there. So we do speak to that in that context, but it's not something we've really delved into in the rest of the report more broadly.
Yeah, kia ora. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. And the Commission is always developing and refining its methodologies, Alex, so potentially in the future that might be an area that is considered. Thank you for your patai. I want to move now to a question from Darren around iwi hapū. So Robin mentioned some iwi and hapū in essence are leading in their current approaches to adaptation. Are there specific examples we can learn from? Robin, do we have some specific examples to share?
Kia ora, Darren. Yes, there are many, and we mentioned some of these in this report, but I would also point people towards a couple of documents on our website, in particular a big case study report from about a year ago of a trip that some of my colleagues did up to Taitokoro and highlights a number of really cool pieces of work happening up there. But I think the one that I will mention now is in Makatū in the Bay of Plenty. I know at least a couple of people involved in that mahi are potentially in the audience today, so shout out to them doing some incredible work in Makatū and highlighting both what's possible but also the frameworks and structures which need to be further refined through working with local council and at a national level in order to really realise the benefits of that effort.
Yeah, kia ora, Robin. And yeah, as Robin mentioned, Northland case study, some fantastic examples of iwi hapū-led adaptation. We will, in our follow-up email to you, all provide links to that case study. And also, as Robin mentioned, Makatū. So we have a kōrero on the work being done there by the team there on our website, which we can also share. So there are some fantastic examples of community leadership, and we want to mahi to those of you who are leading in that space. Want to move now to a question from Donovan, which potentially could be our last question. How does the Climate Change Commission distinguish between adaptation planning and adaptation being mainstreamed into Crown and Council decisions? What evidence shows that these decisions are actually reducing climate risk? Do you have outcome indicators for this. Sally, what kind of ways do we measure how the decisions are reducing climate risk?
That's such a good question, Donovan, and you've touched on something that is a really significant challenge for us in our monitoring role. Monitoring at the impact of adaptation action is really, really challenging. Adaptation cuts across so many different areas and so many different things, and there's no easy quantifiable way to monitor progress. And you'll see that as quite a strong theme in the assessment part of our report. This is a very qualitative assessment, and it is that by necessity. We don't have the equivalent of an emissions budget or a target that we're monitoring progress towards, and we do have advice in our progress report around ways that we think the next national adaptation plan can be improved to support more effective goals and objectives and things that progress can be monitored towards. But in terms of your question there around what evidence is there around decisions actually reducing climate risk and how you monitor that is a really tricky one, because understanding the counterfactual in the adaptation space is really challenging, and it's something that we've been thinking about a lot. And the Insights report, companion report to this piece of work that Hugh mentioned, and we will have the webinar on that on the 14th of September, is looking at sort of aspects of climate-related risk, which is one of the easier spaces to quantify, but it still has the same challenge of the understanding the counterfactual. We might be able to see how the risk is changing, exposure, vulnerability, etc., over time, but it's very difficult to attribute changes to specific policy actions. So that's an area where we really sort of have a lot of conversations about and really want to continue to improve and build over time, and having a lot of conversations, including with our international counterparts who have similar monitoring roles to us, to try and understand how that side of the monitoring can be done more effectively. So perhaps not a satisfactory answer to your question, but a really important challenge that we're really trying to focus on.
Kia ora, Sally. O te rā, kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for all of your questions.